are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Wednesday at 10 a.m. to talk about job hunting, starting and running a business, building wealth, all of those financial matters that provide the resources to live the kind of life we want to live. So whether you, want to live a relatively modest life, or you're angling to be, I don't know, the next Elon Musk, this is a place where we discuss all those things. Although, truth be told, full disclosure, not aiming to be as wealthy as Elon Musk or anybody of his ilk. So today I'm going to be talking about dressing for success. And this is a topic, as you might guess, near and dear to my heart, since I always show up in a collared shirt and tie, and I have a vest on. It's kind of my trademark, I come from an era when Larry King was one of the most popular talk show hosts. He had a show called Larry King Live, and he always was in shirt sleeves with braces or suspenders, and I think he wore a bow tie, if I remember correctly. I remember seeing him in a restaurant in Los Angeles once. I was sitting at a table facing my date, and he was at the table on this sort of platform. But I looked up, and there he was, because I had heard his voice. And I'm like, I must be going crazy. I'm hearing Larry King, and looked up, and there he was. And not frankly dressed as dapper as he did for his show, but still looking quite sharp. And there was a time when especially men and women prized dressing well, and we have not been in that era, I think, for quite a while. And then with the coming of COVID, that seems to have put I don't want to say a nail in that coffin, but it certainly exacerbated the situation. And so before I get into some thoughts about how to dress for success, I think I need to make the case why it's important. So first of all, there are numerous studies that have shown for decades that how we dress has an impact on how we behave, how we perceive ourselves, how other people perceive us. So if we want to be performing at a peak level, then we need to dress in a way that encourages us to do so. And contrary to popular belief, wearing pajamas or sweats does not encourage us to operate at peak level. So it's a kind of strange phenomenon, but comfort and peak performance don't align. So when we take care as to how we dress, and when we dress as if we're doing something important, we will be more motivated, I should say, not motivated, but more motivated to do something important. So you see this with young people in school. So schools that have a dress code, generally speaking, the students behave better, they learn more, and they overall perform and get much more out of school than schools that don't. This is one of the big arguments or ideas in favor of school uniforms. Now, there are other benefits of school uniforms, to just digress for a moment, and that is that students don't spend, an hour every morning figuring out what they're going to wear. And also, the uniforms sort of ipso facto mean that the students are going to be dressed appropriately. So Now, this is not about school uniforms, but um, the it's the same um, it's the same idea with how we dress for our day, right? So if you've ever watched movies in the 1950s, for example, so the fellow showing up to deliver milk or the cleaning, he's in what amounts to a uniform, usually some kind of coveralls with the company name on them. He typically had a hat, and that uniform identified him as uh, essentially someone working in that field, right? A representative of his company. And I argue that it's a shame that companies don't do this anymore. In fact, even the US Postal Service, if you've noticed the casualness with which, I guess we don't call them postmen anymore, postal workers, I think is the term, the casualness with which postal workers wear the US postal systems uniform, it's very, very different than it was even 10 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago, or when I was a child. So now, coming out of World War II, where so many men and women were in uniform because they were in the military, so uniforms were, very widely adopted. They also provided clothing that was appropriate to the task, and that could be, usually they were made from materials that could be easily cleaned or more easily cleaned. So, coveralls, for example, for people doing delivery services or maintaining cars, working in factories, those kind of things. So nowadays, there aren't a lot of people performing those jobs, with the exception of things like DoorDash and Uber Eats, where I guess they are delivering things, but these are gig workers. And I mean, I don't know the statistics, but for some of them it may be their full-time employment, but for many it's kind of their part-time employment. But for plumbers or electricians, you don't see often these days companies providing uniforms for their employees. And when I do have a service person come to my house who is dressed with some sort of obviously company issued uniform, it's very impressive. And I will say that generally speaking, not generally speaking, almost always get better service, a more polite person. And I'm not saying that that's because they're wearing a uniform, but I think it's part of the ethos of the company. We take pride in our work. We take pride in our appearance. We take pride in how we talk and work with our customers. And so all of that is a part of the whole ecosystem, to use kind of a highfalutin word for this topic. And so I would encourage you to think about how you dress impacts your work. Now, it's an interesting thing, because when someone goes to a meeting to discuss a job, i.e., a job interview, generally speaking, they will give thought, sometimes a lot of thought, to how they dress. And the stakes are high in such a meeting, right? And so it's I guess the thinking is it's worth one's time to give thought to one's appearance, right? Much less so once the person's working for the organization. And I think that's unfortunate, because we should take as much care how we show up each day that we take in when we're trying to impress the company enough to hire us. And for those of us like me who have a business or a professional practice, I think we need to set the example. So when I meet with people, I had a staff meeting yesterday, for example, at a company that's an asset for one of the estates that I administrate. So when I show up for that meeting, I show up dressed like this. Now, not the same shirt, right? But I show up dressed professionally. Now, the other people, it's interesting because the first time we we all there were four of us on this team. The first time the four of us met, one of the members showed up and he looked at the other three and said, "I didn't know you dress this way," right? Uh, and I said to him, this is how I dress every day, right? And the other two members of the team are women. They always dress very professionally, modestly, beautifully, I might add. And so the next meeting, he came dressed in a suit, right? So, and I think that's important because we're trying to set a particular level of professionalism at the same time that we're building our teamwork so that everybody can work together as well as possible, right? And yet at the same time, I have frankly very clear expectations about language, about behavior, and I'm old fashioned about how men treat women, and this has been a topic of conversation at a couple of meetings. I don't permit foul language in front of women, and I don't like women men talking to women with like, honey, how that kind of stuff. So by dressing in a professional manner, it sets a tone, and I think that's to the benefit. And it is interesting to right now. This particular company doesn't have an office, so we're meeting at a coffee shop. I'll give them a shameless plug. It's Verve in downtown Los Angeles on I believe it's Santa Fe Avenue and San Mateo, right around in there. And fantastic coffee shop. So one of the ladies found the location, suggested it, and we've been meeting there every week since then. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. Now, most of the people at Verve they're individuals, or maybe they're one or two people together. A lot of them are working. They have their earbuds in and their computer, their laptop in front of them, right? Dressed very casually. Now that's fine, but it is interesting because they see us there and they know right away we're meeting for business, right? And yesterday is a good example. Young man next to us, he's got his earbuds in, he's got his computer, and he gets a call and he starts talking like other people aren't there, and then he glanced over us and he saw we were dressed similar to the way I'm dressed today, and all of a sudden he dropped his voice so he wasn't disturbing us because he saw that we were in a business meeting. So people behave very much in accordance with the, I don't want to call it the dress code, although I set the example and would have people follow my example if at all possible. But people will behave in accordance with how they're dressed or how leadership of the company is dressed. And I think it's crucially important today that companies have an ethos of dress along with an ethos of behavior, along with a mission and a purpose. And so all of these things work together to create the kind of environment that either supports the team members in doing their best and having opportunity for professional growth, or doesn't, right? And if we want our business to be successful in today's environment, if we want to be successful in today's environment, we need to do everything we can to, number one, motivate us to peak performance. Number two, keep us focused on the tasks at hand. And number three, make us a cut above the competition, right? Competition is brutal these days. and it's not competition's not going to drop. I was having this conversation with a friend on Monday. In the 80s and 90s, in many ways, were a lot easier time. That was, pre-smartphones. I mean, the 80s were just late 80s, maybe not even late 80s. I think you didn't have social media, so all of these things, smartphones and social media, the internet, while they've increased productivity in business, they have also made business much more competitive, and they've increased the pace at which uh, business operates. So these are the kinds of things we need to keep in mind, and we need to gear ourselves to deal with them as effectively as possible. So when we dress for success, we're making sure that we are as prepared to face the realities of the business world as we can be. And comfort is a fine thing, and I can assure you, after my day is done, I say my prayers. I make myself a highball, typically a scotch and soda, or a whiskey and soda, as the English would say. And I go take my shower, and I relax, and I put on sweats. But at that point, my work day is typically done. Occasionally I'll do something after dinner, if I've got a project that I'm working on or whatever. But most days, once I'm done with my workday, I'm done, and so that's why I can put on comfortable clothes. And comfort is the rule in the evening, and comfort is not the rule during the business day, because during the business day, peak performance is what's required, and what I need to be motivating myself to do. So I have a few thoughts on how we can dress for success, and I want to talk to you about those, give you some things to think about. And before I do that, I do want to share one more story with you. So when I was in the Navy, when I was in my first billet as a Navy chaplain in Okinawa, Japan, as what's called a collateral duty, meaning a duty in addition to my regular duties. I was the brig chaplain. Brig is the Navy and Marine Corps term for jail. And once a week, I went and visited it was almost all young men in the brig. And pretty quickly, I realized that most of these young men were not going to be going back to their job in the Marine Corps. They were going to be either administratively separated by the Marine Corps, or they were going to be discharged on, at best, a general discharge, and maybe even a dishonorable discharge. And they were going to be going back into the civilian world. And most of them were very young, 22 years of age or younger, so between 18 and 22. Most of them had very little job experience. And most of them, the reason they were getting kicked out of the Marine Corps is they had committed what I somewhat tongue-in-cheek called the big stupid. Like they drank too much alcohol out in town one evening, and they got a little belligerent, and they got belligerent, not a little. They got belligerent, and they, put their fists through the window of a taxi. And luckily for them, the Japanese police turned them over to the Marine Corps rather than putting them in the local jail, right? And so these young men needed to find a way to they needed to find their way in civilian life now, and they didn't have the military to fall back on. And one of the first things they were going to need to do was find a job. And so I started doing a series of classes each week on things like job hunting, resume writing, the sort of basic skills that they needed in order to, as well as possible, land on their feet once they got back to civilian life. And one of the classes that I did was on dressing appropriately for the civilian, for civilian business life. And I remember typically I had almost all almost all the young men in the brig were there for the class. The young women always showed up, but typically there'd be maybe one or two at the very most, and usually for a short period of time. And that was because there was one particular Marine who saw to it that all the other Marines showed up, because he was a staff sergeant and he was used to taking care of Marines, and we had struck up a friendship, frankly, and he knew what I was trying to accomplish, and he wanted to help me with that. So I was doing this class on dressing for success, and I was suggesting that you know. And now this is going back to this would have been 2007, 2008, right around there. So, 15, 16, 17 years ago, whatever it is. And I suggested that, depending on what industry they were going to be, in which they were going to be looking for a job, a coat and tie wouldn't be necessarily inappropriate. And even if they were going to be, for example, looking to get a job at, let's say, Lowe's or Home Depot, showing up for a job interview in a sports coat and tie with a collared shirt and nice slacks would certainly set them apart from the competition. And to his credit, one of the young men, stood up. There's a certain protocol that has to be followed in the brig when you address someone who's not in the brig but is there, to work with you. And he stated his name, and he said, "Sir, I disagree with you. I don't think it makes any difference how somebody dresses." And I said, "Well, tell me why you think that." Now, I think that surprised him. I think he was assuming me to say something like, "I'm an officer, I know better, sit down." But no, I mean, if he was willing to stand up and say it, there were several of the other young men in the room were undoubtedly thinking it. So I said, "Well, tell me why. I mean, I'm perfectly open to hearing reasons why." And he said, "Well, I used to be in the entertainment business before I joined the Marine Corps." So I said, "Oh, what'd you do in the entertainment business?" He said, "Well, I was a DJ." "Oh, okay, great." And he said, "If I showed up at a gig with a tie on, they probably would throw me out." I said, "Yeah, that makes sense to me." I said, "So how did you dress?" And he said, "Well, usually I had kind of a suit with a shirt, maybe a t-shirt or open collar shirt." I said, "Okay, exactly." Right? You dressed appropriately for the industry in which you were working. I said, "My preference for ties. Look, I get it. I'm old-fashioned." But the reality is, in a lot of job situations, wearing a tie can be appropriate in the sense of conveying the message that you're taking this job seriously and you're interested in succeeding. Now, if you're in a profession like, and I named the Marine, I don't remember his name now, I said like such and such, where setting a tie is basically looks stupid. So then, of course, you don't want to alienate your customers, your clients. There's no point to that, right? So I think the key thing on this is that we need to dress appropriately for the industry or business in which we're working. So interestingly, these days, what I found is, unless someone is in a business or profession where they routinely go to court, men don't wear ties anymore. So lawyers who go to court wear ties. I wear a tie because in my fiduciary practice, I attend court hearings. Okay, although I was taught no matter why you're going to court, um, you always wear a tie out of respect for the proceedings and the judge, right? But outside of that, I think lawyers, when they're in their offices, typically don't wear a suit and tie. I know I met with an accountant for one of the estates that I'm handling last week, and I went to see him at his office, and he was in basically workout clothes. Okay, fine, and he knew I was coming, but look, he needed to be comfortable. He was preparing a giant tax return. It was literally a stack of papers over a foot high, right? But if I suspect, by the way, if I were a potential client coming to see him at his office, I bet you he would have been dressed differently. And indeed, when he appeared on my show, this is now going back years ago. We've had a relationship now for I think about 3 years. He was dressed. More professionally. Now, by the way, I was dressed in workout clothes too, because all I was doing was going down there to sign the return, and I worked out with my trainer earlier that morning, and then I had to jump in the car and go down to see him so that I didn't get caught in traffic coming back, right? So, but in general, the only business or profession anymore where someone wears a suit and tie, again, is people who go to court. Uh, um, maybe people on Wall Street do. I'm not familiar enough with that world, or maybe they keep a coat and tie hung on their door, their office door, so if they have to go meet with a client, they can put on a coat and tie. But otherwise, they work in their office in slacks and a shirt sleeves or whatever. I don't know. The key thing is we have to know what the dress code is for our profession. Okay. And my advice is whatever the dress code is, comply with it to a more formal level rather than to a less formal level, right? So in any dress code, there's a range of what's appropriate and or allowed. And I recommend always being to the more formal side of that. It conveys a message of seriousness, of intent, and of a desire to excel in your position. Okay. And if you're a business owner, right? So you're going to set the policy, right? And again, I'm not suggesting that if you're in a business where where men don't wear suits and ties anymore, that you wear a suit and tie, although maybe you do. Nonetheless, whatever the standard is in your industry, that you stay on the more formal side of that standard. Okay, whatever standard you set, your employees are generally going to be not quite at the same level you are. Okay. And if you find someone who's exceeding your standard, that individual is probably looking to send you a message about what his intentions are in terms of success, not just in your business, but success in life. Right. So let's talk a little bit about dress codes. So again, it used to be, certainly in any kind of profession, whether it was law, accounting, financial services, insurance, um, uh, investment banking, all of those, and also, by the way, the C-suite, men wore business suits. Okay, now some business suits were more formal than others. Black was always considered the most formal color. If we go back 100 years, uh, you know, black business suits during the business day was de rigueur for bankers, for lawyers. Okay. that was sort of formal business dress. And then there was sort of business professional, which was maybe, a tone down from that. You might, instead of wearing a black or a very dark blue suit or a very dark gray suit, those were the only three colors in business formal dress. You might wear light gray or even a brown suit. In the summer, if you live in a hot climate, you might wear like a khaki colored suit, brown khaki as opposed to green khaki. Okay. And generally speaking, men wore white shirts or maybe a blue shirt, especially if it's formal. Those would have been the only two colors, white and light blue. Not even French blue, the sort of medium blue color, but light blue, the color of the shirt I'm wearing without the stripes. And then the ties would have been sober. What I mean by sober is you wouldn't have seen paisley ties or print ties. You would see maybe a rep tie. That's a tie that has the sort of slanting stripes on it, or a single color tie. This tie is not a formal tie. First of all, it's a raw silk tie, so the material alone is not formal. But the fact that it's got sort of a pattern to it, that is not considered a formal tie. By the way, neither would polka dots. Polka dots would not be considered a formal tie. So striped or solid would be really the only ties that were considered formal. And then for shoes, it would have been closed-toed shoes. And with a black, dark gray, or dark blue suit, the shoes would have been black. Now, they might have been wingtips if the person was had a particular whimsy, but other than that, they would have been black Oxford shoes, similar to what is worn with uniforms in the military, unless you were in naval aviation like me, in which case the shoes were brown, and that was it. And then when women, entered the professional workforce, so they typically wore tailored dresses or tailored skirts and blouses, and then eventually pantsuits became part of women's wardrobes. So that was the equivalent of a suit and tie for men. So again, the only place I think you would see that today is maybe on Wall Street and then in court. So, but then there's what we might call business dress now. That's typically how I dress, I guess, is business or business professional, however you might term that. And so, for example, when I had a court hearing, I believe it was last week, if I recall, I wore a light gray suit. It's springtime here in Los Angeles. As I recall, it was supposed to be a hot day. And so I wore a light gray suit. I think I probably wore a light blue shirt. And then I wore a patterned gray tie. I think it had, spots on it or something like that. Truth be told, I wear slippers because you can't see my feet. Now, if I'm going out, of course, I don't wear slippers. But that would be, business professional. Now, sometimes if it's in the when it for the few days in Los Angeles it's cold in the fall and winter, so I will sometimes wear a vest. I don't have any three-piece suits anymore. I did back in the 80s, but not anymore. I may typically wear a sweater vest. It's comfortable. It's not as bulky under a suit, and it adds kind of a nice touch to it. I like vests with pockets because sometimes I will carry a pocket watch just because it's fun, and I have a couple of pocket watches that I got from my grandfather that I like to carry around, and it helps me to think about him. But other than that, and then for if I'm wearing just a sort of regular business level, so I might wear loafers. My preferred shoes are penny loafers with pennies in the tabs. Again, it's an affectation. I admit it, but I prefer loafers because they're easy to slip on and slip off. But I do have tied shoes as well, and and that's kind of it. Um, you know, ties can be much more varied with just a sort of a straight business dress code as opposed to a formal business dress code. I know at one time I had a number of um, Disney ties. One had all the Disney villains on it and things like that. Those are a little bit too loud for me these days. But I do have a couple of paisley ties, and I love raw silk ties. I have two or three of those. Um, and I have one tie that's ducks and dogs of all things. I'm not a hunter, but it just, I don't know. I saw it several years ago. So, I use ties to bring a bit of whimsy, to how I dress. They will sometimes be a conversation opener. So, someone may comment on, oh, that's a fun tie. That's an interesting tie. Oh, thank you very much. And now you have an opportunity to speak to the person, which is always a good thing in business. Uh, Sometimes I wear bow ties. My former doctor used to tell me that I always looked like a pediatrician when I did that, because I guess pediatricians wear bow ties. Not that doctors wear ties anymore, but back when doctors wore ties, they wore bow ties, because if they wore a long tie like this, the children grab onto it and choke them. Right. But I like, and if you see me on my show, Jiggers's Place, you see me in a vest and bow tie. So, different things, different ties for different moods or whatever. I typically will take, 10 minutes in the morning to decide what I want to wear, based on what I'm going to be doing that day, and kind of how I'm feeling. And so that's another nice thing is, the way we dress for business. We can add, these days we can add a bit of self-expression to it, and again, we create that opportunity for interaction with other people. So that's a sort of business or business formal side of things. And unless you're in more of a trade, or some sort of outdoor business, construction or something like that, you're not going to go wrong dressing that way. So I was talking to my nephew a few weeks ago, and we somehow we got on the subject of how to dress, and he was lamenting that he hadn't listened to his mother about learning to dress appropriately. My older sister, his mother, at one time was a fashion designer, so she was the one who taught me how to dress. And I remember I was going to a dance when I was in college. I didn't have nice clothes, and her roommate and I were roughly the same size. He was taller than I was, but we were roughly the same size, and he loaned me a beautiful pair of tan wool gabardine slacks, and an absolutely exquisite double-breasted blue blazer, and I had a shirt and tie, and she put in a pocket square, and we had to shorten the pants temporarily because they were too long for me. But I felt like $1,000,000 when I was dressed that way, and that was due to the good offices of my sister, who knew such things. And this friend of hers was someone I think she had gone to fashion design school with, so he obviously knew how to dress, right? And so as I recall, I was going to a sorority party, not something I was comfortable doing, I showed up and with my date, and she was very pleased to see me so nicely dressed. And it was at a private home, a beautiful private home, and the photographer was super impressed, and because a lot of the people there didn't take the time to dress nicely, and several of them proceeded to get very drunk, and much to the chagrin of the host and hostess. And I think there's a connection between the two, So that's kind of the business side of things. Now, if you're in construction, or some other kind of trade or whatever, so then you're not going to dress like I do. It would be inappropriate. If I showed up to fix your sink dressed like that, you think I was crazy and maybe not even let me in. Okay. And then there's kind of the middle ground. So like people who work in technology. So I have a very close friend who has worked in technology, fields for many, many years now. And he dresses in jeans and a black t-shirt every day. Right. And I guess that's the uniform of technology. And I think that's sad, frankly, because what people do in technology companies is important. And I think they would do better work if they dressed like the importance of the work they were doing, I guess is the best way to put it. You can say I'm being judgmental. Okay, fine. But that's my take on it. So, if I were working in a technology company, I would probably dress this way every day. And if my colleagues didn't like it, well, okay, too bad for you. But we're working in an office or working in an office environment, even if working from home, and I think it sets a particular tone. It certainly sends a message about how I want to be treated, and for me, that's important. So I think that's something also worth thinking about is how do we want to be treated by our colleagues, and how can we dress in a way that sends a message about that to other people. So and then there are people who are more in some of the arts professions, like the fellow I mentioned when I was doing the class at the Brig. He had formerly been in the music business or film business, whatever. So what I find is there's sort of there's two ways people go, and that is if they're more on sort of the technical side, they're gaffers, grips, that sort of thing. So then they're going to dress in jeans and whatever, because they're dragging lights around, they're dragging props around, that kind of stuff. And that's perhaps that's appropriate. Of course, during the golden age of Hollywood, they would have been dressed in coveralls. That was sort of the de rigueur uniform. And then the people, the sort of above the line people, the actors and actresses, the director, the producer, the AD, those kind of people, if we're talking about a film or some kind of video production. So they may be dressed in a more arty style, if you will. So yesterday when I went to Verb, as I walked out the door, I grabbed one of my hats. I had my, fedora. It makes me feel a little more arty and kind of goes with the vibe of the place. And I think the people there appreciate that here's this old guy, right, who's, making an effort to fit into the atmosphere that they're trying to create. So there are people who dress in a more, kind of arty way, and I think that's wonderful. And there are others that, they just show up in their, pajamas or sweats because they're going to be changing into a costume or something like that if they're an actor or actress. And so then they don't think it matters. Now, it is interesting if you see pictures, again, from the golden age of Hollywood, of directors. They were typically wearing a suit and a tie, or a sports coat and slacks and a tie. So they actually dressed that way. Those were not publicity stills. Those were the way people actually dressed in the 40s, 50s, and even into the 1960s. I don't think that's the case anymore. But I know my friend and longtime production partner, Rick, he always wears a tie when he's directing. He wants to set a particular tone on his set. And I'm usually on the production side, the producer or executive producer of the projects we've done over the years. So, it's my obligation to support him in that. So when I'm on his set, I'm in a tie, right? So these are the things I would encourage you to think about your industry and about how you dress, and how that dress is appropriate. Now, just a few kind of quick hints on how to, no matter how formal or informal the dress code is for your industry, there's certain principles, I guess we could call them, that I think apply across the board. And one of them is good fit is a must. Okay, so clothes should fit you well. They shouldn't be grossly oversized or way too tight. There was a trend where guys were wearing jackets that I think they were at least a size too small. They all looked like the Pillsbury Doughboys sort of. Not a good look, no matter what. Never was a good look. I know it was kind of a popular style for a while. Never a good look. Clothes should fit you appropriately. And especially if you're getting nice clothes, sports coat, or slacks, um, have a little tailoring done so that they do fit you, so that they're not too pinched at the waist or too slack in the bottom, or very baggy at the shoulders. Many of those, with not a lot of money, those a tailor can correct those and make it fit nicely for you. And I will say, there's no feeling so wonderful as putting on a made to measure suit. I've never had a bespoke suit made, but I've had made to measure. It's wonderful to put them on. So I would encourage you, especially if you're going to get nicer, more business professional clothes, to get them appropriately tailored. But even if you're going to wear, let's say, coveralls, so coveralls can be tailored as well, and they will fit more comfortably. They'll look better, and you will look more professional in your work by having them tailored. So as well, your shoes should be polished, assuming that you're not wearing some kind of canvas shoes or something like that. And this is just my preference. Men should always wear closed-toed shoes at work, even if it is not a dangerous work site like the deck of an aircraft carrier. Closed-toed shoes are a must. I do prefer women wear closed-toed shoes as well, although that is not necessarily the case. There are, trends in women's shoes, and sometimes open-toed shoes are perfectly fine in a professional, situation. But if the shoes should be clean. If they're leather, they should be polished. And it's not a lot of work to polish shoes once you know how to do it. Now, in my day, you learned how to do that in the Cub Scouts, or like my dad taught me to do that, I think, even before the Cub Scouts. So that's how you did it. And you want to be neatly groomed. Your hair, nails should be, appropriately cut and all that. Now, that's not to say you have to have short hair like mine, but whatever hair you have should be, neatly groomed, as opposed to sort of wild and, bird nesty, as we used to say. With respect to colors, neutral and muted colors, you're never going to go wrong with that. Now, in more art-oriented situations, fashion, media, those kind of, so then, muted colors aren't the necessity necessarily. Although if you're on the business side of those professions, you probably do want to dress a little more conservatively. And so, you're not going to go wrong with muted colors. And the other thing about muted colors is they tend not to go out of style, right? Whereas, whatever the color is this year, it's probably going to change next year. You may not be dressed appropriately by wearing sort of last year's colors. So neutral colors, dark blue, medium blue, gray, black, white, off-white, those are all very safe choices, and they're perennial choices. And then if you want to add some color, if you're a man, you can add color with a tie or a shirt, pocket square. Pocket square. Make sure I have it on the right side. For a woman, you can add a scarf, maybe a bracelet. So those kinds of accessories can add a little bit of color, and they can help you change, if not dress up, what is otherwise a sort of neutral or muted color outfit. Accessories really should be minimal. Again, depending on the industry that you're in. the sort of art and media industries are always an exception. A little bit more uh, flamboyance is perfectly acceptable. Okay, but if you wear a watch, okay, I have my Apple Watch. I have several other nice watches, but I've seen people with two watches, an Apple Watch and a regular one. Don't quite understand that. On the Sabbath, I don't wear my Apple Watch. I wear a regular watch. Okay, and like I said, sometimes I have a pocket watch, which is a kind of a fun accessory. One or two of them have chains even, which is very sort of old fashioned. Um, I only wear my Oura ring generally during the week. Obviously, if you're married, you're going to wear your wedding ring. For a woman, certainly one ring on each hand, absolutely appropriate. Maybe more depending on your profession. On the other hand, none may be right if you're in a profession where you use your hands a lot and they're going to get damaged. Okay, and again, earrings. Um, Look, if you're in the some sort of media, multiple earrings I think are probably acceptable these days. So, but in any event, in general, being a little understated, you're never going to go wrong. Okay, being overstated might might turn some people off, and if having a relationship with those people is important, that will be a detriment for you. So it never hurts to be a little bit understated. And then you want your clothes to be pressed, iron, so there's no wrinkles. Now, that can be difficult if you're wearing linen, one of my favorite fabrics. Linen, the look of linen is a bit rumpled. Okay, that's just how it is. Now, in general, I don't wear linen for business because it does have that rumpled look, but it is one of my favorite things to wear when if I'm going to go out in the evening or, after hours. Like I have some linen slacks that I just wear around the house sometimes after the workday is done. Linen is a beautiful fabric. It has a certain feel to it that no other fabric has. Now, linen blended with silk or with cotton doesn't wrinkle as easily. It doesn't have that rumpled look to it necessarily. And so, and the great thing about linen is it's a very breathable material, which is why it was worn in hot climates. So if you live like in Southern California, like I do, or Arizona, Texas, where it can be very hot, linen is a wonderful fabric to wear because it breathes so well, and it won't feel as warm if you're outside. So and if it is hot outside, the fact of the matter is we perspire, clothes do look rumpled, but when you're in a warm climate like that in the southeast, that's just sort of de rigueur for how it is. So it's not necessarily a faux pas to not look um, absolutely, freshly pressed and all of that kind of thing. Okay. Now, I like wearing cologne, but I'm careful to not wear a lot of cologne, just a couple of squirts, and so that during the day, once in a while, I'll get a whiff of it, but it's not a good idea to wear a overwhelming scent. There are people who are allergic to it, but it's nice to have a whiff of scent, and then if you are going to carry a briefcase, or if you have a backpack, it should be neat, professional looking. I mean, unless you're an outdoor guide, in which case it should be professional looking, but you're not going to get something polished leather. It's going to be practical for the work that you do. And then finally, how do you figure out what is the appropriate dress code? Well, the best way is to look at what are the more senior people in your profession or business. How do they dress? Okay. And you will not go wrong if you follow what people who are farther along in their careers are wearing. Now, I know that's somewhat unpopular today to, do what older people do, so to speak. But the fact of the matter is, you know, those people who are senior to you in a business or profession, they have influence, if not a great deal of control over your professional progress. And so it may very well make sense for you to send a message to them that you're willing to conform to the dress standards that they're setting for that particular industry. There's nothing, cloying or brown nosing about that. So that's a good way to know. The final thing I want to say is dressing for success means dressing in a way that gives you confidence. And I'm going to end up where I started, which is how we dress impacts how we behave, how we think, how we perform. And if we want to strive for excellence, then we need to dress for excellence. And we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that dressing for comfort prepares us for excellence. Rarely is that the case. Okay. So unless maybe we're a masseuse or something like that, where we give a great deal of physical movement in our work. Look at baseball players, look at football players, basketball players. Okay. Uh, their uniforms are not nearly as comfortable as we might think they are. Okay, they in those uniforms, there's durability, there's identification, there's safety built into those uniforms. If they were dressing solely for comfort, they probably wouldn't wear big shoulder pads on football players. They wouldn't wear the kind of helmets that they wear. Those are not comfortable. Okay, so, and these are some of the top performing people in the world. Okay, so I encourage you to think about that when you think about when you maybe right now you're rejecting the idea that dressing for comfort means that you're not dressing for peak performance. Let's look at the people who perform at the peak athletically. They're not dressing for comfort. They're dressing for peak performance. And we need to do the same thing. So I encourage you to dress for success, whether that looks like me or whether that looks like the more senior people in your profession or industry. That's the way to go. So I thank you very much for joining me today, letting me get on my soapbox here for almost an hour on a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. If you have any questions, comments, all the links to social media will be in my show notes. Feel free to drop me a comment, criticism. Have at it. Tell me why I'm crazy. I'm open to it, just like the fellow in the brig. And maybe we'll start a conversation. And if you have something personal, you can always email me. My email address will be there as well. So tomorrow at 5 p.m. is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place. We're going to have a cocktail. And as the Jewish holiday of Passover approaches, it starts on Saturday night, I'm going to be talking about biblical commandments, what they are, why they are, and it's probably not what you're thinking. So I invite you to tune in and have a cocktail with me while we talk about something completely unrelated to finances. So that's tomorrow at Jiggers' Place, 5 p.m. Pacific time. Next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific is my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. On Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. And then a week from today, I'll be back for the next edition of People Making Money. So thanks again so much for joining me, especially all the folks live. A little bit higher numbers today. Not sure why, but maybe I'm going to have some converts out of the show. That would be terrific. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for the comments, Hasib. Thanks so much. And wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. And signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. I hope I always look like your beau that you want me to be, that you told me I was. Courage at all.